assembly with no public input. And so we held our own public telling at the Capitol. We had over 100 people there. We got to talk to cardboard cutouts that actually listened to us more than our own assembly members, which was actually effective because, believe it or not, we got to actually have them pay attention to us. And for the first time in 13 years, we got a hearing on we got a public hearing on a redistricting bill in Wisconsin. Can you believe that?
Did it? Cute.
I mean, it's exciting, but man, they did not give us any time to plan. 10 days later after that. And so we rallied folks again to the Capitol. And we made sure our people showed up and showed out. And I'm so proud of everyone that took time out of their day to then give them 5 hours of testimony, over 5 hours of testimony, and let them know that we deserve a seat at the table. And that wasn't the end of it. Because again, people feel like they've had the door shut on them when it comes to our maps for years. And so we had an opportunity again to rally folks at the beginning of oral arguments when our partner organization, Law Forward, which big shout out to Law Forward because they are rock stars in this state. They went in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, said our maps are rigged, they're gerrymandered. Who would have thought? And they won in front of that Supreme Court Monday. But we rallied people all across Wisconsin. We let them know that we are not going to take it anymore, and we're done taking it. And post the Supreme Court decision, and as we waited to find out how it was all going to shake out, we continued to lobby the legislature, the governor's office. We made sure that the people of Wisconsin had their voices heard and had a seat at the table. And on February 19th, 2024, the governor signed the bill that made the law to bring fair maps to Wisconsin. And we are on the cusp of doing something amazing here. And it is because of the support and the love from people that are here, the people that are tuned in virtually, the people that are not here that have been fighting this fight for years. And I'm so proud that I get to be a part of this fight. And it's everything that I get to, again, I had the baton passed to me, and I don't get to take credit for all of it because I got to watch the people like Carleen, the people like Matt, the people before me that were busting their butts and were getting the door slammed in their face. And so now it is so important that we continue to talk about these things and we continue to take advantage of the fact that we have fair maps here. And that's why we have this star-studded panel in front of you, because to answer all types of questions, even your questions. And so while I'm just talking about fair maps, I saw somebody really important in here that was really a part of fair maps, and I just want to talk about them briefly, and then we're going to dive into this. So who knows Senator Tim Cullen? And raise your hand. When I say no one, everybody knows who Tim Cullen is. All right. So, I mean, Senator Tim Cullen is a trailblazer in my eyes. And I remember seeing Senator Cullen. And not only when it came rally time, but when we were in the governor's chambers and he signed the maps. And I think it would be lost on me not to give him his flowers right now, because he has been somebody that has been walking the walk and talking the talk for decades. And not only that, he's in the midst of writing a book that literally is about to be published that talks about this entire journey. And I think it's just something that deserves to be plugged, because it didn't all just happen in this last several months. It has been a decades-long journey. And so please, everybody, when the book comes out, give it some love. But right now, while Senator Cullen is in the building, we should give him some love and just give him a round of applause, because he's fighting. And so, I don't know if you guys know, but we have been busy. Between the board and the staff, I mean, we've gotten together and done some strategic planning back in March. And we've been just road mapping what are the priorities, and we're going to continue on a regular basis to think about quarterly how we're going to continue to level set and think about how we're going to protect our democracy here in Wisconsin. We're going to continue to fight back against the dark money that comes into this state. We are going to continue to hold bad actors in their state accountable until they seek justice. We're going to continue to work our tails off to make sure that the integrity of our elections are going to be preserved so that every eligible voter can cast a ballot that counts. And I don't know if you caught our on Monday, the statewide tour that we launched, but ballot drop boxes have been back in the news. And we have been like Harlem Globetrotters across this state, traveling to Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Eau Claire, Wausau, to make sure that the voices of those healthcare heroes, those single parents, those people within our disabled community, the people that live in the rural communities, get an opportunity to have their voices heard, because there were strips 2 years ago when they took those ballot drop boxes away, when they were talking about ballot harvesting. Like, who the hell knows what that means? And so I just want, well, I need to flip the page because my finger's sweaty. I just think that at the end of the day, we're really confident that the Supreme Court is going to be able to hear the people on this one. If they're going to, we ought to applaud them because it is highly unpopular what they're doing. And I just want you guys to know at the end of the day that, like, with your support, there is no stopping this organization. And the reason why that we keep doing it and why we do it at such a robust level is because of you. And so now that you've heard me ramble for long enough, let's get to the meat and potatoes of this show. Tonight's panel was specifically assembled to discuss the future of redistricting and fair maps in Wisconsin. Each of these experts bring a unique perspective to this topic, and I'm so excited to introduce them to you and dive into our program. I've got a set list of questions for the group to roll through, and then at the end, we'll leave time for folks to be able to ask questions to the panel. We'll monitor the time and get you all out of here at a good time so that you can go to sleep, because this food will put you to sleep. But now I want to introduce each person one by one by sharing a little bit about each of them. So, this handsome gentleman to my right, you may know him. His name is Jeff Mandell. He happens to be an attorney at Stafford Rosenbaum, but he also is the board president of Law Forward, which he co-founded. Which he co-founded with fellow Stafford attorney Doug Poland. Jeff is one of Wisconsin's leading election law litigators representing Disability Rights Wisconsin, the League of Women Voters, and other nonprofit clients, as well as Governor Evers in challenges to the 2020 elections. Jeff graduated with high honors from the University of Chicago Law School and has been named a best lawyer since 2021 in his appellate practice and commercial litigation. And the Best Lawyers Organization named him Lawyer of the Year for 2023 in his appellate practice. Jeff happily lives in Madison with his family and is active in the community. Is that a correct assessment, Jeff?
Fair enough.
Right on. All right. To the right of Mr. Jeff, this is a dear friend of mine. Oh, yeah. Wait a minute. That's all right, Jeff. Anyways, this is a dear friend of mine, somebody that I've known for quite a bit of time, and it is such a treat to have her here. Angela Lang was born and raised in the heart of Milwaukee. She has an extensive background in community organizing. In the past, Angela served as both an organizer and state council director for the Service Employees and International Union, you might know it as SEIU. Man, forget this. I want to actually talk about Angela for a second.
My bio is more.
Yeah, dude. I'm sorry. So Angela has been a trailblazer in Milwaukee doing a ton of organizing. Have you heard of her organization Block?
Yes.
When you need somebody to shake some cages because the job is not getting done, because there's injustice happening, who do you call? It's not Ghostbusters, it's Angela and Block, right? And they have been doing God's work in Milwaukee since 2017. And so, sincerely, like, it is a privilege to be able to have somebody that has been having their feet on the ground and mobilizing and organizing people and getting people hope when it feels like everybody wants to just lean into the status quo. So please give a round of applause for Angela Lane. Anyways, next up, I'm sorry, Julie. I got all this background for you. So when thinking about just the diverse voices when it comes to maps, I wanted to really think about somebody that could really lean into places that we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about. And our rural community is one that when it comes to our maps, I feel like a lot of times we forget about. And so, you know, and please forgive me if I butcher your last name, because
just Julie Bomar.
All right, so we have Julie Bomar. She's the executive director of the Wisconsin Farmers Union, and she's been doing that job since 2018. And I've gotten to watch her from afar. Like, I've gotten to watch her from afar since I got into this work, and let me tell you something. I mean, she is literally a trailblazer in spaces that I just want to be in and want to be just, I just want to be inside her brain, because the things that she's been able to do has just been sensational. And so she out there, oh, well, I mean, how far did you travel again?
3 hours.
Jesus.
Chippewa.
Oh, Chippewa, right on. God bless you. So Julie was an educator and an academic administrator. She worked, you know, up at UW Stout and up at Eau Claire, and spent 13 years, you know, wow, I mean, your resume is crazy. Do you really want to read all this? This is nuts. Okay, I will. Anyways, everybody give it up for Julie. Educational background. All right. The last one, and this man flew all the way from North Carolina, is that correct? Or DC? DC. Wow. This is a real tree, ladies and gentlemen. He is a hometown boy. So Jacob, at the far end, Mr. Jacob Carrel, he serves currently as counsel at the National Redistricting Foundation. Jacob works on the organization's impact, litigation portfolio, supporting challenges to gerrymandered electoral maps, monitoring cases of key doctrinal interest, and advising redistricting reform efforts. And so he's been deep into the fight as far as redistricting for quite some time, and he's going to be providing the overall national perspective on maps. And so please, ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Jacob Carrel. I'm going to take a seat with these lovely ladies and gentlemen. So, what is your why for the work that you guys do? I mean, I did talk a little bit about just your intros, and I did give Julie a little bit of the gong here. So, like, as far as going through your intro, but what is your why? Like, specifically, you have all been involved for quite some time as far as being civically engaged. So why do you do what you do?
This mic's there, that should be on the mics.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like because I know you, you're wanting us to get personal, so I will. So I was raised by a single white mother in Milwaukee who struggled to figure out how to raise a Black child as a single mom. And then when I was 12 years old, was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And I remember this was 2001. So things like the fight for 15 and paid sick days weren't actually conversations. And so I saw a lot of inequity when I grew up, but I didn't have the language for it. And for a lot of us, it was just accepted that this was the way things were. And so I started out in student organizing, started doing a lot of nonpartisan voter registration in 2008. And then I did that for a couple years, and Scott Walker was elected. And let's just say I got a little active in that. And I realized I wanted to do more. And even my last year at UWM, I thought I could just sit out. And I was like, I'm just gonna chill my last year, I'm gonna focus. And it was in that moment I realized I'm not built to sit on the sidelines. I have opinions and I like to share them. So as much as I wanted to stay behind the scenes, it just didn't feel right in my spirit to just like see injustice, whether from my childhood or, you know, the challenges my community was facing and down to even being a college student. It just wasn't in me to see stuff happening around me and not be able to try to play my part in helping my community. And I'm born and raised in Milwaukee, so Milwaukee is very home and near and dear to me. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to kind of give back to the city that raised me, and that's always been a common thread in all of my work.
So, I think somewhat like Angela, I relate to this idea that I am just not really built to sit on the sidelines. I'm someone who went to law school with no intention of being a lawyer. I was interested in the Constitution. I was maybe going to teach. I was going to do things like that, and somehow actually wound up practicing law. And 9 years ago, we moved. I'm not from Wisconsin. 9 years ago, my wife and I made a decision to move to Madison with our kids.
Welcome.
And thank you. And part of what we were looking for was a place that we could raise a family that reflected our values. And we knew about Act 10, and we knew about Scott Walker. But I don't think we realized how far Wisconsin was receding and how quickly from the things we cared about. And there are a lot of people out there who think that lawyers are magicians and they can do anything. I will tell you, I actually kind of think the opposite. I think we way overestimate what lawyers can do. But there are some things we can do. And when in 2018, when the people of Wisconsin spoke and handed all of the state offices to Democratic candidates, and the legislature's response to that was to turn around and kneecap the incoming people instead of saying, let's think about democracy, let's think about how we put out better ideas or better candidates. I got angry, and actually Angela was one of my first clients. We, you know, the League of Women Voters and Block and DRW, we brought a lawsuit to stop that power grab by the legislature. And that just sort of snowballed. I started working closely with Doug, who had already been deep in the redistricting fight for years with Carlene and Bill Whitford and others. And as I said, and as Angela said, sometimes it's hard to sit on the sidelines. There is so much need in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was fading so quickly. And that's why I do it, and that's why we created Law Forward.
Turn it on.
Well, thanks for being here, folks. Is it on? I think it is. Let me get a little closer though.
There.
Well, I can just say, like Angela, I grew up watching adults in my life that I really admired, and they were fighting fights that weren't very popular at the time. My mom, who has had severe rheumatoid arthritis since she was 21. My brother, who's passed away now, had degenerative brain disease and uncontrollable seizures. And my mom just has fought for the rights of people with disabilities. And she herself was a special education teacher. My dad was an environmental education advocate, and I just watched them, and I think that ignited, a drive to really make sure that systems were fair. And I grew up as a little girl anyway, in southern Utah, when I saw Danae and Ute kids being bused in from reservations, 2 hours by bus, and being horribly discriminated in the school system. And it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and my parents told me it was wrong. And it just ignited something inside of me that it's been a lifelong calling. And so I started to try to, maybe from almost like a a perspective of helping, I went into international development work and found that it was really top down. And it was really about making people conform to what we wanted them to do, rather than actually empowering people from the grassroots. And I jumped out of that, eventually went into anthropology, and have worked with immigrant communities through my PhD and through my work in cooperative extension, worked with folks in jail, worked with meth addicts, worked trying to do community or organizing work through a system that really didn't allow me to do it. Because it was cooperative extension, I was a state employee, right? And I was trying to teach people like how to balance their checkbook and not spend money when they were making $7.50 an hour. And there was no way that you can balance your checkbook out of that. And so when I decided to step out of a faculty role, I found the Farmers Union and somehow they let me in. It's an amazing progressive group that cares about fairness in the food system. And I've met so many incredible folks who have been fighting the fight for decades and decades to stay on land, to have fair wages for labor. And it's just been a miraculous experience. And so every day I get up, and almost every day, and I am so happy to go to work with the people that I work with as staff and the members of the Farmers Union. They're an amazing bunch of fighters out there. And I've been schooled in so many things, from barnyards to, walking through the Capitol to organizing, and it's been an experience of a lifetime. So I'm really just happy to be here on behalf of all those folks.
Julie just said, so lucky to get to join the Farmers Union. I feel so lucky to join this panel. This is really, I'm just so honored to be here. So I grew up, as Nick alluded to, I grew up here in Madison. And I was a public school student in high school when, in 2011, a lot of power changed. And I think we all know that. And
Yeah.
I was there with 100,000 of my closest friends, many of who I'm sure are in this room, when we were living on the Capitol floor for several weeks. And, I was very motivated by that. And I had, just before that, I'd been involved in a few campaigns and learned from some of really amazing organizers, including Carlene, who Nick shouted out before, and Liz Trevino, and so many other role models who I've gotten to learn from. I could tell that there was something really important in organizing and in listening and understanding what someone was interested, understanding what someone wanted before you could jump in and try and do anything. So I kept organizing. I eventually left the state and did organizing elsewhere while I was in school, and continued to do a lot of work on voter registration, particularly on college campuses. And not just four-year campuses, but every campus. But like Julie was saying about some of the international development work, I also began to see that sometimes that work can be, not always, can be top down. Then I went to law school because I was going to solve top downness by going and getting more law school, which is not the move.
Yeah.
But then I went to law school, had the opportunity to learn a lot about voting rights work. And I had seen that pattern where, as Jeff mentioned, people assume that a lawyer is somehow going to solve things that, is not there for a lawyer to solve. So I was really lucky, following my law school experience, to start at the sort of bottom level of the National Redistricting Foundation, which is a hub organization that works on fair maps and redistricting reform, and works to just like all of these organizations here, to not be that top down, to be that hub that's an opportunity for learning and for sharing best practices. And so integrating organizing and legal arguments, integrating broad-based listening and communication with policy work. And so, I just feel so lucky to, when I was last, really dedicated on the ground in Wisconsin, it was some of the worst of times, when it was first happening, and now, you know, having seen what everyone here on the ground has been experiencing for a lot longer than I was when I was there, getting to be here, with all of you in this sort of hopeful moment where we're at an inflection point. So I'm here because I'm so excited about what's happening and so honored to get to join you.
But before we just jump right into the future, when I say the words gerrymander, what does that even mean to a bunch of experts? Like, I know what it means to me. What does it mean to you guys?
To me, the word gerrymander means contempt. Right, I grew up with the quaint idea that the people actually control our government, right? I mean, we the people. That when the people lead, the leaders follow. And what gerrymandering means is inverting that. Making sure that the leaders aren't leaders at all, that they're just people who sort of select themselves and their friends and run roughshod. And that's not the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I think for me and how I've always kind of talked about it is that it's intentionally subverting the will of the people. And when you have things, in one of my previous lifetimes and jobs, I worked for SEIU. And I worked for SEIU during the 2014 gubernatorial election. And some folks will strategically put ballot initiatives on places to get, you know, higher voter turnout and engagement. And that particular year was Mary Burke was taking out Scott Walker. And we had, I believe we had a Badger Care question, but I know for sure we had a legalizing marijuana question on there. And it got to a point, we even had it, you know, in I think 2020 or even, you know, since then. And when you're educating the community and letting them know, hey, there are these ballot initiatives, you also have to explain they're kind of just a glorified survey because they're non-binding the way maybe some other states are. But still, even with that, people are like, okay, I still have a way to make my voice heard on this particular issue. And then you see the results come back and these referendums pass overwhelmingly, 50, 60, sometimes 70%. There is a documented record that this is the will of the people in the state of Wisconsin. And then some people who will remain nameless in a certain party will see those things and be like, that's the first thing we're gonna take off the budget just because I don't want to, right? And it comes down to one person in a position of power to have everybody else fall in line and to push their own agenda and not feel the pressure that every elected official should feel when they are not upholding and actually advocating for their constituents. And so we see how that has limited people's ability to make their voices heard. People get excited to vote for these things. They get excited when they pass and they're like, they come back to us and I was like, so why aren't we doing this? Why aren't there movements? What's the point of even having this if it's gonna get ignored? And so to me, that's what gerrymandering is. It is literally taking the will of the people that has been well documented through a democratic process and still not giving the people what they want.
Yeah, the question around, you know, what are your first thoughts? I kind of have to go back to when I first learned really about gerrymandering, my first experiential kind of encounter with it. So I live in Chippewa Falls, I lived in Menominee, that whole Chippewa Valley area is pretty tight area. People watch the same news, read the same newspapers and that kind of thing. And there were really competitive races going on, especially in the Eau Claire area, the way that the maps were drawn prior to 2011. And people really had to go out and work, you know, to win. And they were in an area where they had to compete with both urban and a rural area. I think of Eau Claire as urban. Maybe all you all don't, but if you're in Madison area, but we think of it as urban. And you know, they were winning by like 1 or 2 percentage points. Those were tight races. names like Jeff Smith, Kathy Bernier, Pat Kreitlow, those names, I mean, they really had to work. And so Pat was, an anchor. So he had a lot of visibility on WEAU News. And we watched that news station and we watched his, get into office and everything. And then I remember my husband said one night, my God, they drove that map right up his garage. And they did. And he couldn't win, and then we have Kathy Bernier also who, comes in and she also had to compete as a Republican. And I remember calling her over an issue when I was working in cooperative extension, and she listened, and she stood up to her party on that issue because that broadband line was running right up 53, Highway 53, right into the neighborhoods and the territory that she was representing, and she listened. And then once I got into Farmers Union, and we were, extremely gerrymandered, the hostility with which our lobby group, including young people, is greeted by some of the politicians really stands in my mind as like, you don't give a shit. And you can treat people badly, even in your own party, because you think that they're this or that. And so, just the abrasiveness, and that's so foreign to me. I mean, I was a kid who went to DC and talked with, I was from Wyoming at that time, Al Simpson and Malcolm Wallop, and they were friendly to us and they listened to us. And to have that abrasiveness and the fact they don't even have to care really shifted during that time. So it's abrasiveness, I think, that and unwillingness to listen. That's what I think of.
That's contempt too.
Yeah, I want to say two things. I don't want to sound repetitive, so stop me if you've heard it. But I think gerrymandering is corruption, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, I mean, it's so many things, but it's about, contempt for accountability. It's about, not to use Julie's words, like not giving a shit because you don't have to, because you're there because you want to be. And so as I said, just before, when I first started at the National Redistricting Foundation, it was sort of just understanding what this was happening. And now that I've grown through the organization, we see this pattern across states. When a gerrymander is put in place, other state institutions get undermined, right? So we saw this in Wisconsin. We saw the way Nick talked about dark money, like the way they changed the Government Accountability Board. We talk about the way they undermined the former long-serving Chief Justice of Wisconsin. And we see this in other states too, right? There are nonpartisan institutions that get undermined because fundamentally a gerrymander allows for removes accountability, and it is corruption. And the other thing, just building off what Julie said, I think there's a misconception about a partisan gerrymander that it only hurts, people who aren't members of whichever party puts together a partisan gerrymander. And I want to be really clear that a partisan gerrymander hurts everyone. Just think about this for 1 second in a primary election. A college student in Madison could easily be drawn in with, say, a union carpenter from Mount Oro, and they might vote for the same party in the general election, but might have very different issues that they care about in the primary. And the same is true for a small business owner in West Bend and a more rural, someone in a more rural part of Fond du Lac County. They, again, other party, but might vote for the same party in the general election. And when you go back to those primary elections, they've become reduced to just who they're going to support in the general election. And it undermines the real power of every voter, regardless of party, regardless of whether they even support a party, in service of just the people already in power.
Mm-hmm.
Just to build off of that, so for the other panels, because that's a really good segue, what were some of the lessons that you learned during the extreme partisan gerrymandering that we had here in Wisconsin?
I had a few thoughts about this, talking to candidates and folks who maybe didn't have a strong opinion, for example, on gerrymandering. I learned that people said, well, you know, they did it this time, that it'll happen again, and the other party would do the same thing. As if that's a rationalization or justification for it, you know, like what kind of goes around comes around, but without acknowledging all the impacts and the harm that it does. And then also I really found out people don't understand it. It's a little wonky, you know, and so Farmers Union put together a video, for example, it was just kind of simple at some level, but just educational, that explained like what happens when, and you know, very carefully, like this is how it's crafted, and then these are the impacts. And I guess just, you know, the lack of willingness for people to run for office. And you know, when 2018, 33 of the 99 state assembly races featured candidates who ran unopposed. That's just dangerous. When and so un-American that you would actually you know, have things so fixed. And I've traveled the world and lived in countries where, you know, there's one person running. I lived in Kazakhstan for a while, and you know, and traveled in the former Soviet Union, and you know, you kind of see what it means when there's just a figure that's going to win. And that just felt like so wrong to me during the extreme gerrymandering phase.
What did I personally learn? Everything. Because this is my first redistricting process. Like I remember the last go around, but I was swept up in kind of the Walker kind of issues. And I remember it was like kind of connected, and like sometimes on the news people would talk about like these secret meetings that happened, and I'm like, I don't understand, right? And so yeah, I think the biggest thing is to educate people. And I know I'm particularly proud of the work that Block did. We were able to knock in some of the most like distressed neighborhoods, the most incarcerated zip code 53206, and educate people about what gerrymandering is. I don't know the last time anyone has knocked in the hood and said, hey, let me talk to you about redistricting. It wasn't happening. And so, you know, with the support of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and Liz Trevino and Eric Holder, we were able to really get our team up to speed and like not put them out on doors until they were comfortable, because it's not an easy conversation. It's a little wonky, it's a little in the weeds. How do you frame it in a way that's very easily and accessible to a community? And we were able to submit over 100 plus community maps to the People's Maps Commission for them to just get tossed out. But we knew that was going to happen. But being able to talk to folks about why it was important that folks participate in the process. And a lot of what we heard too was, well, what can I do? Like, well, it's all legalese, what can I do? And so to try and energize folks that, you know, paying attention to the process, putting pressure on your elected officials and candidates, making sure that you're not voting for candidates that aren't committed to fair maps. So I think we had to get creative because there was such a strong legal heavy presence, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a key organizing component that worked hand in hand. And so it was really nice to kind of see how that played out, because I think now with that organizing and that litigation strategy working closely together, you're bringing in new people to a fight that maybe typically didn't know about it before. They definitely felt the impacts of it before, but likely didn't know how to even get involved. And so I think we were more strategic this go around, and I think we will be the next time as well. But being able to bring in new people through that education, I think was a big takeaway.
Nobody's been better at combining and finding ways to bridge that gap between the legal and the grassroots in Angela, because Block, right, we're all here to talk about the victory in the Clark case and what comes from that. But remember that Clark wasn't the first case, nor was it even the second. I mean, there are a whole, right, we can go back in history, but Clark wasn't the first case this decade. The first case this decade that gave us the bad maps was Johnson, but Johnson was also really the Block case. We had already filed in federal court with Block as our lead plaintiff, and then the state Supreme Court decided to take another case, and it all got folded together. But I think the piece that I didn't fully appreciate until watching it up close in Wisconsin, and that I think we all still need to appreciate now. I mean, Senator Cullen and we were just talking about it over dinner, is that it infects everything. And it's not going to go away in a moment, which is why one of the reasons, right? The legal strategy doesn't work without the grassroots strategy. The organizing is essential. And it doesn't work on the front end, but it really doesn't work on the back end. Because even if we win the case without the organizing strategy, without the public education, there's going to be a hangover. The entire way that our legislature works and that our state government works have been corrupted.
Definitely.
And it's going to take time to fix that. It doesn't all just snap back into place. And I think that's really the next big challenge.
You all led in very different parts of the redistricting fight. Was there intersectionality amongst your groups? Were there other key stakeholders that were involved? Or Jacob, you don't want to answer.
Well, I feel weird. I hesitate to answer first, quite honestly, because, you know, it should be led by folks who are here in the state of Wisconsin, because it really was. But I think it's fundamentally an intersectional issue, because it has to be, as everyone I think has been saying, it has to come top down. This isn't going to be bottom up. So yeah, I really just want to defer to everyone here.
But it takes everyone's work, and we you know, when we talk about gerrymandering, we in this room are talking about deliberate partisan gerrymandering to pick winners and losers. But we also know, right? I mean, Angela talks about how many maps members of Bloc submitted to the People's Maps Commission. Think about how many maps members of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign probably submitted to the People's Maps Commission. Think about how many maps you could theoretically draw of the state of Wisconsin that would meet basic criteria. There is no one answer to this problem. This drives my kids crazy when I talk about this part, right? But there is no one answer. And every map can be manipulated in different ways. So we talk about having partisan gerrymanders. We talk about having racial gerrymanders. But you can also imagine urban-rural gerrymanders. Anytime you're trying to privilege one set of voices and one group over another, you in some way have a gerrymander. And so we need the intersectional approach if we're going to have anything that approximates a fair map. Because if the only people sitting at the table are the folks in Madison and Milwaukee, then the rural folks are probably not going to be treated fairly. And the goal here is to work for the people and make our democracy work, which means we have to find a way to include everyone. And that's one of the things that when I look back, what I'm, you know, when you ask me about what I'm proudest about the Clark case, I would say that it's the small role that I had, because we had a big legal team, but we had an even bigger coalition that we were working with, and that we did everything we could to put in the front of the effort.
I think for us, yes, like prison gerrymandering is something that isn't talked about a lot, but is like a whole thing. And I remember that was one of the more agitational pieces for our team. And a way to also get people thinking, because people are like, wait, prison gerrymandering, how does this work? And resources and allocation. Because sometimes as a good organizer, you gotta sprinkle in some light agitation to move people to action, or at least that's how I was trained. And so there was some of that. I remember one of our first events that we did with the National Democratic Redistricting Committee was Eric Holder was like, I want to do an event with Bloc that targets young Black people. And I was like, okay. And so it was like, you can't announce it. It's not, you know, I want you to have it invite only, because if I'm going to come to town, I want to prioritize this conversation with folks that don't often get a chance to have this conversation. And everybody knows Eric Holder as like Obama's bestie. So like that was also an extra draw. But I remember like being so appreciative that he was like point blank said, this is what I want to do and I want to partner with you on that. I think another thing that was huge for us as we started to get involved, because I'll admit we were not a part of the coalition, you know, from day one. We tried to figure out what this work looks like for us. What is our angle? Is there an organizing aspect? Because we were all new to it, right? Like if this is a litigation fight, what is our lane? How do we fit in? And we learned very quickly what that was. And one of the things that I, you know, was talking to folks, and there were coalitions that were like, we want fair maps because we want fairness and fair representation, which is great. Absolutely. And what we were not saying is that a lot of Black and brown people were like, we want fair maps because we want policies that don't kill us. We want fair maps because we want driver's licenses. We want fair maps because we want legalized marijuana, all of these things. And I realized that there was a slight disconnect in both of those conversations, equally important, but we identified that there was a gap. And so for us, we started kind of meeting together as like Black and brown organizations of like, how are we supporting each other? What is the angle that we're using? Can we work together on an event? Can we throw down together with our respective communities and learn from each other? And so that was a really, I think, important space that kind of made it more concrete for a lot of folks in our community. And it wasn't this like big amorphous thing in front of the Supreme Court that is so out of reach. It personalized it for folks. So we had to be intersectional to kind of get people hooked in of how it directly impacted them.
Mhm.
In terms of intersectionality, I think in the farmers union, it really starts at the very grassroots level under a big tent where you meet farmers from all different backgrounds. It's not a big kumbaya moment. There's some really hearty debate. Bring up wolves, for example, you know, and conventional, organic, smaller farms and what are considered now to be like almost medium or small, you know, small, large, I guess. You get some really amazing debates going on, but there is a process by which policy is developed. And so that's intersectionality in the fact that they are coming together to form a policy and then advance it to a special order of business that we're gonna really lift up. And gridlock, corruption, these are all terms that came up around gerrymandering. And you know, one of our members, Hans Breitenmosher from Marathon County, what an advocate for maps. And he was we turned to him a lot to just speak about, like, as a dairy farmer in Marathon County, how does this affect me? And he was elected at the local level too, so he was in the system that he could see becoming more and more partisan. But across the board, I mean, our members advance this issue. So that's an interesting scope on intersectionality that you might not think of all the time. But then when we pull it out to the state, you know, we look at, and Angela and I have done a little podcast episode on this when we talked about urban and rural cooperation and collaboration. And, you know, from Milwaukee's lead pipes to Baraboo's PFAS, to Menominee and Emerald and the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff that we're getting, you know, into class 1 trout streams and into water supplies that kill livestock and people eventually. We have a common issue in water quality. And the majority of Wisconsinites want something done about it. Urban, rural, we need to address this. And the thing that stopped it was gerrymandering.
Yep.
And so if we can't come together on what sustains us and living next to the Great Lakes, then we are in wicked trouble.
Yeah.
And so I think that we really do have to talk about these commonalities, and we have to cross lines of difference in order to do it, even at the micro level, like in the farmers union, you know, big tent. But it's doable. We've seen, like, we're coming together. And so it's amazingly hopeful and inspiring that we are all sitting here today. We just need a lot more of that.
It really is. For the lawyers up here, minus me, After years of litigation and battling in court on redistricting, why were we able to see victory in court this time? And can you break it down for us more than an ideological shift? Because I think people are going to look to that and say that. So were the arguments just not nearly as good in the past?
Oh, so the court was gerrymandered.
So the court was gerrymandered too. There is an ideological shift, but I actually think it all comes back to the organizing. How did Justice Protasewicz win? Well, she talked about the maps. She didn't talk about the maps because her biggest priority in the world was to overturn the gerrymander. She talked about the maps because she was running a campaign, and that's what the people were interested in. And that comes back to the work that Julie is doing, and the work that Angela is doing, and the work that Carlene is doing, and the work that the Democracy Campaign had been doing for years and years and years to lay that groundwork. It goes back to, you know, what I said earlier, the sort of old cliche that when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And does anybody remember that there's a famous early 20th century political cartoon of you know, the Supreme Court follows what the voters want. It wasn't about the Wisconsin Supreme Court, it was about the US Supreme Court. It's the same idea, right? The legal arguments weren't better now, because the legal arguments weren't bad in the past. And, you know, I wasn't involved in the Baldus case or the Whitford case, but the arguments there were correct too. The lawyering there was incredibly high quality. What changed is that the conditions so that those arguments could finally take root, and that's really about organizing, about public education. And the quality of the work that was being done, amplified by how bad things were getting and the fact that people were finally willing and able to hear it. It is wonky. It is a little hard to understand. It is a little off-putting, but things had gotten so bad that everybody in Wisconsin was looking around saying, something doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel like, I mean, it's easy for, you know, but I think there were lots of people in Wisconsin who were saying, this doesn't feel like the place I grew up anymore. This doesn't feel like the state my grandparents and my great-grandparents built. And even people who might not share every one of our values or might not agree with us on every issue felt that something was wrong and were able to understand that that got traced back to the gerrymander. It was the gerrymander that was really destroying Wisconsin. And because of that understanding, the legal arguments finally worked.
Wow. Yeah, I want to echo everything you said, Jeff. I mean, you were in this fight for a long time, and you were really the person to speak on this. I want to add that I think these movements happen at different levels, right? So there was also a legal movement that was happening, and Wisconsin has been at the forefront of the bad way, now forefront of the good way, which is that, you know, as federal courts, in certain cases, when federal courts have let voters down, state courts have stepped in to fill that gap. So in 2019, I mean, we talked about Bill Whitford a second ago. The case right after Bill Whitford's case, Gilby Whitford, then there was Rucho, where in federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court essentially abdicated its role in policing partisan. And they said in their case, you know, but state courts can, and I would say implication should, police state using the state constitution. And I think what we're starting to see are that state courts are looking more closely at their using their state constitution to protect voters. This is not universal, but where it's happening, it's really, Wisconsin is at the forefront. So groups like Law Forward have been leading that effort. Groups like the State Democracy Research Initiative, which is housed, you know, down the street at UW Law. These are groups that are ensuring that the federal constitution's protections for voters is the floor, but is not the ceiling. And then there are so many more tools that are enabled by organizers who can push to make this possible, right? Who can say, hey, this is the problem I'm having as a voter. How am I protected? Or, you know, at some point when you have a more favorable legislature, maybe there's a policy change that can happen. But all of that is only possible at the organizing level. When organizing is first, and it starts in places like Wisconsin, and it moves national. And it's so fantastic that Wisconsin is now on the, you know, the positive trend is starting in Wisconsin as opposed to so many of the things we saw.
All right, lawyers, you did a good job. Now it's time for my grassroots people to speak now. So for Angela and Julie, how do we engage folks for the long haul on voting maps? Because it seems like, especially going into a presidential election, feels like voter apathy seems to be at an all-time high. Maybe the read might not be right, but maybe right. I don't know. So how do we engage people in the rural communities, in the Black community, within the Hmong community, the communities that we're working in tirelessly? How do we engage them on maps, especially when we have this new opportunity with fair maps?
Well, I think people are really tired of the hate. And they're tired of the hate. And if we can connect gerrymandering, you know, with the rise of the divisiveness in our society, which it does exacerbate, I think, you know, this is just anecdotal, but my husband's on the county board and he went and knocked 500 doors, you know, just recently and in April, March, and he just says he's nonpartisan, and he is, and it's a local office, and people have said repeatedly, I'm so glad to hear that. They'll ask him, are you Democrat, are you Republican? And he's like, I'm running because I'm just nonpartisan. We just, you know, these are the issues I care about, but I'm nonpartisan, and people are saying, thank you, and I'm sick of this. And I think that we can connect, you know, you have to connect at the heart at some level on this. And so for an organizer, that's what you have to do. And so if we can say this is a way to decrease the hate that we're seeing by not, you know, putting it into law, but trying to create a fairer, more kind society, I think that's important. For rural people, it's a lot of awareness raising, and we know that there's different ways to raise awareness in rural areas. For example, put this on your car. Everyone knows what pickup truck you own driving through town. You know, put it in your yard. And progressives in rural communities especially are kind of scared of identifying because there's the divisiveness, right? But they're all there. And the other thing that I've been advocating for years is let's empower our BIPOC folks in rural areas too. Because we've got a Somali American community in Barron, we've got Latinx, you know, just exploding in Trimble County. We've got sizable Hmong populations across the state, and we don't always empower those communities in the same way that we would in other areas of the state. But they're there and it's coming up. It's a good thing to see. And I think the other thing is just really, we have to be very clear in drawing these connections because it is kind of wonky. And rural people are no different than any other population, and you got to connect the dots and you got to do it from the heart. And I think that's really where we need to be in terms of organizing.
So the first thing I had written down on my notes was connect the dots. You know, I think unfortunately we don't teach civics anymore. I'm pretty sure I learned about redistricting and gerrymandering in high school. I don't know what the hell that meant in like 2010, right? Or how it related to me. I thought it was a bunch of just white men legally fighting, which to a certain point it kind of is. But you know what I mean? Like being able to connect the dots, and it's like, tell me an issue you care about or an issue that you're frustrated with, and I can tell you the policy angle and specifically how that's attached to gerrymandering. If your issue is that public schools are not being fairly funded, let me break that down to you of how that also relates to gerrymandering. And so being able to educate our team to, you know, take these issues that people are telling us on the doors day in and day out, and being able to say, hey, this is the broader reason why there hasn't been movement on that issue. Here are the villains, quite literally, we have to paint the picture of who the villains are that are obstructing these things that these community members want. So it is connecting the dots, relating that issue that people have and connecting that thread about the issue that you care about and you're frustrated about it, let me tell you the gerrymandering angle. And that takes time. It takes time to increase people's civic awareness and people's civic analysis. And I think it's multiple conversations. That's why we're always talking about year-round organizing. We don't just come in a couple weeks or a couple months before an election, because you can't get into that nuance. You can't have those more fruitful conversations to actually move someone. And I also think it's important too, that, again, I keep harping on this as like the non-lawyer, although I like to fight, but yeah, I like to play a lawyer, but like I'm not. But like, as it being sometimes a very dense issue, you have to make it accessible. And that starts by like even publishing things in multiple languages, making sure that it's not this like academified version where somebody reads a pamphlet and they're overwhelmed and have no idea what you're talking about. And so all of that I think is important. And every time we're knocking on doors for an election, someone has some sort of complaint about something. And a lot of times we hear, well, how did this happen? How did we get here? Or why can't we have this? Why can't we have that? And the answer to that is gerrymandering. So it's an opportunity for it to be an educational component. And even though like the process is, basically kind of playing out for right now and won't kick back up for another couple of years, there's still a way to continue to talk about the effects of it and how it relates to people's current life too.
Right on. We'll probably do one more prepared question, and so audience, you're gonna have a chance to ask them, interrogate them for about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll get you out of here. So what are some barriers that you foresee with redistricting in Wisconsin going forward?
I wrote down, they're gonna be a cities versus countryside. And it's already starting, right? You've seen some of the ads, the Tammy Baldwin ad, connecting with Madison. It's already
And
ramping
she
up.
has done a lot connecting with the rural.
She
South,
sure
too.
has, it's a
So
lot. It
why not
really is a
follow
lot.
her?
Yeah, this is a C3 conversation, but
Yeah.
we work with Tammy all the time.
Yeah.
So does the Farm Bureau, right? So, I think the thing is though, we're already seeing it's rural urban.
Yeah.
And then of course, that's a racialized,
Oh,
it's a dog whistle, right? So we've gotta really reach across across the entire state on this one. I think that's super important. And then the wording of the amendment, it has to be clear, because the last election, that was very intentional to write some really ridiculously worded amendments that people didn't understand. They're calling people like 5 minutes before they walk into the poll, like, oh, how do I vote on this? So really making it clear, like vote no, vote yes, that kind of thing is important. Those are some barriers.
I'll just say that, there's still structural needs to make sure that the best maps come from the best process. And this was a fantastic all hands on deck effort to make the new maps possible. But, the dream map comes from a truly independent commission that draws maps in a transparent manner. Maps that are drawn by voters that reflect the diversity of the state, that pass them, ideally unanimously, and they have, listening sessions across the state before and after they draw draft maps, that have fair ranked line drawing procedures, that have strong enforceable protections against some of the ills that Jeff talked about: partisan gerrymandering, racial vote dilution. The best process is going to result in the best maps, and so whenever the time is right for that. I think there's a robust conversation to have about those best practices, and I think one piece of hope from this is that because this has been such a long haul fight in Wisconsin, there has been all that organizing, there has been that education, and that needs to keep happening. But there's the foundation is there, these groups are here, and the other piece is because it's taken so long in Wisconsin, there are models from across the state to build, or across the country to build on, right? States like Colorado have really great independent commissions. There's a large bipartisan coalition in Ohio that has put together a ballot initiative that will, result, if it passes, with the same sort of nonpartisan reform, and so.
Binding.
It will be binding in Ohio,
Yeah.
yes, and we don't have binding referendum here in Wisconsin, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, that we can't start thinking about what these best practices could be, and I think it's important to recognize that the best maps come from the best process.
Few challenges. We're living in a world where we're just in this very hyper partisan dynamic, not just in Wisconsin, but all across the country. And so I see a world where when people want to fight for fairness, the folks that don't want to give up their power are going to dig in their heels even more. And I think it's just going to get ugly, to be honest, because it comes down to who is going to have power to put forth an agenda for an inclusive Wisconsin or one that takes us backwards. And that fight could be ugly, quite frankly. Depending on what's happening in the world, I know I just talked about like year-round education and organizing, but depending on what's happening in the world, sometimes it's hard to hold a whole separate issue like this if you can't fully internalize it and understand how it relates to you. So I do think that a lot of times it's a privilege to be civically engaged, and be kind and be patient with folks that are carrying so much in their day-to-day life that they can't be as educated or informed and show up the way that some of us can. And I think that's something that we always need to kind of check our privilege on. And the last thing I'll mention, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't really come up too much, is that we had a Supreme Court race in the spring. Probably want to keep that.
Or just to stay another years.
I will not comment on that one. I also think, there's other elections and there's other Supreme Court races in the years following. And so if that is part of the formula for fair maps, then we need to make sure that we are showing up. I don't even know, there's 25, 26, 27? Is there one in 27, 28?
29, 30 is the next year with that one, right?
Yeah, so we're running for Supreme Court justices for the next 5 years.
We're all up.
And so that is, I'm not gonna get into the political dynamics. I think we all know that is a critical part of the formula for the next round of the fair maps.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with that. I also want to say that, so the question was, what are the challenges? One of the challenges that I think is really profound is that it's not going to change overnight. As I said before, there are hangover effects. And this has been such a big fight. And we won. And I'm worried that there'll be a letdown, that people will be disappointed that come January of 2025, when we have a legislature for the first time in 14 years that was at least partially elected under fair maps. Remember, we'll still have half of a Senate that is gerrymandered. So we'll have a legislature that was partially elected under fair maps. That it's not going to be a lights on, lights off moment, that not everything's going to change instantaneously, and that's a real challenge. The other challenge that we have as a state is keeping the organizing going and getting out of the habit that courts have to do this. This is supposed to, and this goes back to Jacob's point about process. This is supposed to be settled in the political process. It shouldn't be done by lawyers and judges. We need to make sure that we have a fair court that represents the state of Wisconsin, so that if it has to be represented by judges, that the court isn't gerrymandered, as someone wisely said earlier. But we also need to be working and setting expectations that this shouldn't wind up in court. And that is a hard habit to break. Jacob might be able to give us better national context, but in Wisconsin, other than the 2011 gerrymander and other than the political solution that came out of the litigation earlier this year, we haven't had a politically approved map in my lifetime. I'm almost 50 years old. 1971 was the last one, and so it is hard, and we need to get to a point that people are ready.
Yeah, cream wasn't even cream at that time. Who else? Anyways, well, before anything. Audience, I mean, you've had a chance for me to just ask questions. We gotta give some mics first, so hang on a second. Let me get the runners' mics, and then I'll start.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's that one works, but it goes to the
You could take it up.
I just need one so I can.
Pass it over.
Just pass them. There you go, too many mics, this feels like Spider-Man. All right, read it in. All right.
We'll start here. There's right in the front right here.
And then just, all right, so, okay, you got, you're up, good sir.
Question for Julie, conversation between the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union. Does that take place?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And
Enter my
yeah, say it one more time, good sir, and I didn't catch it.
Asking about the conversation between the Farmers Union and the Farm Bureau. Does that take place?
Yes, it does.
And you may have to explain that.
Yeah, well, we're the second largest agricultural organization in the state of Wisconsin, general ag organization. Lean Progressive have since we were formed in 1930. Farm Bureau was formed in 1922, I believe, in the state of Wisconsin. It's the largest general ag organization, and it tends to lean a little bit more conservative and a little more supportive of big agriculture, whereas we're really advocating for family scale agriculture. They have a PAC. They will back candidates and parties at times. We don't have a PAC. So those are some general, differences. And yes, we have our differences aplenty, but we have gotten together on multiple issues. We are the lobbyists for both of our organizations, speak to each other. I just met with their executive director, took him out to lunch. I mean, so we do have conversations. We often are at odds on some things. Gerrymandering hasn't really come up in my knowledge as an issue that we collaborated on. But we do collaborate when it makes sense on issues like rural health care, mental health issues, some of those kinds of things. Some of the conservation issues are things we've collaborated on too. But we had a pretty big schism for a few years, but I think we're talking more now.
How about water quality on large farms and issues?
Another question.
Yeah, we have collaborated on some, but we tend to often our members tend to support better oversight, and Farm Bureau tends to support less regulation. So.
Warren Gaskell from Western Dane County. Thank you so much for your great works. But my question is, what's the next step for trying to rationalize the congressional maps in Wisconsin? What's the path forward on that mess?
It's a lawyer, yeah.
This on? Okay. It's a harder one. The maps, the congressional maps are gerrymandered. How do we know this? Well, remember that louder. Okay, better. Sorry. We know this because in 2011, all the maps were gerrymandered. In 2021, in the Johnson case, the Supreme Court made up this least changes standard. And it's not just that it is not in the Constitution. The reality is it is against the Constitution. The Constitution says that every 10 years we shall apportion the districts anew. Anew means you have to start over, not start with what you've already got. And we said that to the Supreme Court, and the response was, this argument misses the forest for the trees. Now, I'm familiar with the idiom, but that was the entirety of the response. I don't understand what it means in this context. And so maps are gerrymandered. The challenge, however, is that when, as part of that litigation, a variety of parties had to submit maps to the court chose the least awful of them. And it chose the ones that the governor and the People's Maps Commission had put together for the congressional maps. And so it's a little bit harder. They're the least offensive of things that were written under an offensive set of ground rules. And so it becomes more challenging. That said, I would be surprised if we didn't see further efforts to challenge the congressional maps this decade.
I'm here tonight rather than being at the meeting of Voters First Wisconsin. But it seems to me that the stuff you folks are talking about is exactly what they are also talking about. We're not dealing here with matters of substance like abortion or marijuana or immigration or school busing or anything. It's a matter of process. How do we go about making decisions? And Julie, I think you said that people are sick of hate, and Angela, I think you said that they're sick of all partisanship. One of the reasons behind those phenomena is the partisan nature of our political primaries, where we end up with generally the leftmost Democrat on one end versus the rightmost Republican on the other end. And the massive moderate middle looks at it and says, what's the choice for me between the lesser of two evils? So if you're looking for, looking ahead, which, I think is a forward-looking clue here, if you're looking ahead for the next issue in a procedural or a process-oriented vein, one of the things you might consider is final five voting, where it is a general primary. People are not voting for members of a particular party, they're voting for the best candidate, and the final five candidates go on to the general election. So I was wondering if any of you folks have been in tune with that particular movement, which I see as being a logical successor to fair maps.
Wisconsin Farmers Union members have voted in favor of ranked choice voting. It's not the same as Final Five, but it is in a similar vein. And we've also even changed our processes to have we have weighted vote, but we also have ranked choice voting. So we've taken a spin or two within our own organization on that. And so it never has been elevated to the point where we are putting a ton of resources behind it, but people do see that as an alternative that may help bring a little bit more fairness and less partisanship. So we're experimenting with it. Question back there and then over here.
Hi. I'm supposed to say my name. My name is Ann Schaefer. I'm from Madison. And I was wondering, Jacob, if you could tell us more about national fights related to gerrymandering.
Sure, yeah, I mean, Wisconsin has been the tip of the spear this past cycle on partisan gerrymandering, but there's a whole lot of gerrymandering out there, unfortunately. So just last night, the US Supreme Court allowed a map to remain in place in Louisiana. That is a map that was drawn following a series of court battles. Ultimately, the map that was, I guess it was part of several different court cases. These are all related to the Voting Rights Act. And most likely the Supreme Court's decision yesterday will result in a map that was used in Louisiana that for the first time will allow Black voters in a congressional map to elect their candidate of choice in 2 districts rather than 1, which is a huge victory for representation. There's some complicated doctrine there. Sometimes federal courts have this doctrine called Purcell, where they don't want to change the rules of an election too close to the election, and there's a lot of conversation as to how close is too close. This has become a real anti-voter doctrine. The idea of Purcell, instead of it being, hey, a week before the election, we don't want to move the polling places, it's become 6 months and further out. And so that is yesterday's victory for voters was potentially for bad doctrinal legal reasons, but it does result in a much fairer map. And I want to give one other example nationally that I think I want to connect back to here in Wisconsin. In last summer, the US Supreme Court, in the strongest reaffirmation of the Voting Rights Act in over 30 years, wrote the landmark Allen v. Milligan decision, which is going to protected the Voting Rights Act, and it allows for a new district in Alabama where Black voters will have the opportunity to elect their candidate of choice on the state's congressional map. And it was a fantastic victory. The NRF have been supporting voters in a series of cases in Alabama since 2017. They finally, in this election, 2024, are going to finally see the fruits of this work that has been organized for years and years and years in Alabama. And one thing that I think, we haven't had our primary here yet on the state legislative maps, but Alabama did just have the primary election on that new district. And what you saw is that the primary turnout in that district was up 133%.
Wow. But didn't the legislature refuse to
The legislature,
implement the map?
the legislature in Alabama, yes, at one point defied a court order and refused to implement the map. It ultimately went back to the US Supreme Court, and the map that was now the map that will be used in 2024 was instituted by federal court, and it was a victory. It's a map that came from the plaintiff group. But I think the reason I bring up the turnout is just because people are paying attention, and that, everyone in this room I know is paying attention, but I think what's really exciting is that when there's an opportunity to elect a candidate, when the race is not predetermined a year and a half in advance, people want to participate and show up, and that's where, it has to start with organizing. And so there's a bunch more cases. I could certainly speak more if folks are interested, but I think it has to come back to participation.
Mark Kirstian, excuse me, National Association of Social Workers. First of all, I'm so appreciative of the wonderful work that the panelists are doing as a lobbyist for social workers. Hey, it's so dreadful having to lobby. I was around in 2009, 2011, the one time the Democrats had full control. Wonderful things happened, but they made a huge error of omission that they didn't pass anything regarding redistricting, and they paid the price. Absolutely, we need to look at the Supreme Court races in the future and the governor's race. I want to know, do we have a specific legislative strategy and a bill that people can agree on so that when we have the power, we can pass it, or that we have Republican support? Because I don't want to go back to where we are now. It's hell, frankly. Trying to work for social justice with the maps we have has been, and I lobby at the legislature. It's really horrible, and I'm so excited about what's coming on. So this might be a question for Nick. Is there a specific bill? You got all sorts of bills that were thrown around. Is there a specific bill that we can get around? Are the Democrats around it? Do we have Republican support? Because we need a strategy so we never go back.
I'm going to talk about this.
Yeah, change batteries.
So I was alluded to before as the person doing Fair Maps organizing. I do that with Sally. Oh, there she is over there. And I can tell you that we are definitely working on this, and this is my chance to please take one of these brochures, pass them. There are people in this room who are picking up hundreds and thousands of these today. Is there a bill already? No. And we don't want there to be a bill already, because as Jacob alluded to, what we will get if we have the legislature create the bill, and it won't matter which side, because as you alluded to, Democrats didn't pass the bill when they had the opportunity in 2009. We are doing research on best practices. We're talking to groups like the Brennan Center, the Campaign Legal Center, the National Redistricting Foundation to find out what those best practices are. And then our job post-November will be to make sure that voters and legislators know what those best practices are, and that we craft a bill that will not already be something ready-made. We can't pick up Iowa and bring Iowa over here and put it down. It doesn't work. There's also been a lot of lessons learned from independent redistricting commissions that did their first work in 2020. And some of those were really hard lessons. In Detroit, for instance, there were a lot of folks in Detroit that felt very cut out of the process, much like folks in Milwaukee have felt really cut out of the process. And some of the court battles that arose out of that, even though they had an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission, we need to know about, so we don't do that here. So to answer your question, is there a bill ready? No. Will there be a bill? We're working to figure that out so that we go to the legislature and we say, this is what we want. And we give the power back to the people and we don't. So this is like a 4 or 5 year process minimum, right? We have to get legislation passed as the backstop, then we have to get a joint resolution passed twice to create a constitutional amendment that will then come back to us so we can change the state's constitution, because the maps that we have right now are not are fair for now, but 2030 is going to come and we've got to have something in place that is going to, you know, take us forward forever. And so we don't keep coming back. This is bullshit.
We're sorry, channel to be doing these.
Also, there's a QR code and a what am I trying to say? A website on one of the things at the back. You can order these for your group. And as I said, there are like 8 people in this room who are taking home anywhere from 100 to 1,000 of these for their group. And just make sure I know if you're taking some so that I can get you down on the list.
They'll be available in Spanish, Urdu, Arabic, and Hmong.
Are there any other questions?
That's the Village Forest really.
Mike.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, go closer.
Closer to your mouth.
Closer, okay. I'm Joan Schwartz from the League of Women Voters, and I just want to announce one of the worst effects of the gerrymandering, the constitutional amendments that have been coming forward. We have Marcy's Law, we have the bail amendment, we had the private funding ban from election administration, and we have a doozy coming up in August in terms of the fact that Governor Evers' authority to accept and distribute federal funds has been in existence since 1930, and now the legislature believes that they should have the final say on that. It's pretty serious. They're not in session when we had COVID. So this is a real important thing that we've got to make certain that these maps work, because many of the ones that are under first consideration now, next year, are putting out, we're not going to allow Governor Evers to close houses of worship during the pandemic. I mean, there are some really serious ones coming up. We've got to stop them next year. So that's a bad effect of the redistricting that people don't really get, because the questions are intentionally worded ambiguously and leave out a lot of information.
Isn't this the legislature's effort to avoid Evers vetoing? And isn't this Governor Evers or the legislature's efforts to stop Evers from vetoing legislation, so that they put it on the ballot as a referendum instead, and then purposely don't word it so that people understand. And it seemed like it was at the very last minute too.
Yeah. And the worst part about it is that it's not legislation, that it's in the Constitution.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Constitution is supposed to be the basic charter. It's supposed to be the most fundamental set of ground rules. It's not supposed to be solving every individual problem of the moment, because then we're locked into it. It's very difficult to change our Constitution.
Or the conservative policy.
Yeah.
Last call.
Could I ask a question that really isn't about gerrymandering? Maybe somebody could help me. I read recently about a PFAS money that came from the federal government, and they have committees in the legislature, and one one legislator was able to say no to the distribution of that money anonymously. How is that possible?
Yeah, good question.
So, the question is about the Joint Finance Committee and the ability of individual members of that committee to put anonymous holds on the release of money that has already been appropriated through the budget process. You know, those of us who, have gone back and done a little bit of remedial civics education, because as Angela says, we don't teach enough civics anymore, right? When a bill becomes a law, it passes both houses of the legislature, the governor signs it, or if the governor vetoes it and the legislature overrides it, it becomes a law. And that's how we pass a budget in this state every 2 years. And once the money has been allocated, it should actually be able to be spent. It is the executive, that is the governor, who faithfully executes the law, including the budget. But in this state, across time, the Joint Finance Committee has arrogated to itself greater and greater powers, including claimed powers to stop that, and even to do that anonymously. And some of this is a legislative problem. That is to say, there are parts of our statutes where this is written in that give the Joint Finance Committee certain powers that I would suggest are probably unconstitutional. But some of this is an even greater problem because the legislature is going beyond even what the statutes purport to allow. The governor brought a lawsuit about this, specifically in the context of the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Conservation Program. That lawsuit was argued at the Supreme Court last month. And we should know next month what's going to happen. But I am cautiously optimistic that the Supreme Court is going to start the process. It is going to be a long process with stepping stone cases that build on each other, but start the process of correctly reallocating the separation of powers in Wisconsin. And this one seems like a really strong claim that an individual legislator should not be able to anonymously hold back money that has already been appropriated through the lawmaking process.
Or they use it to blackmail the university to change their policy.
Yeah, that was also part of the lawsuit. The court
That's what
chose
I
not
thought.
to take that part right now.
Well, can we give a round of applause for the panel? All the old fashions and Bloody Marys and whatever.
Tequila.
Oh, tequila.
That's sweet stuff.
And to close us out, I've got Carlene. Carlene, our Princess Leia, can you talk to the group here one last time?
So you all have copies of that brochure. This is the QR code. There's one at the back. If you're interested in, if you're part of any kind of organization that does any sort of tabling or anything, we'll mail you these. We have them printed, and that brings me to the next thing. You heard here all the things that are happening that we need to be concerned about. Everything from, well, connecting the dots. Everything leads back to the gerrymander. I got into this work because I was a public school educator for 30 years, and I testified in front of that Joint Finance Committee, and Heather's here. She knows I was with her with Wisconsin Public Education Network, and they didn't listen. They didn't listen again and again and again, and they're clearly still not listening. If we are going to win in the long term for the people of this state, we have to keep fighting, and to keep fighting, we have to have the funds to do it, because I've said this before, I'm a public school teacher. I'm accustomed to working around the clock, and I work for cheap. I'm retiring in November. People need to be hired to come in to take this place, to help with all of those messaging things, to help with building the coalitions, to do this work, whether it's rooting out money in politics, exposing what's happening with trying to close down more and more voting places, or with getting together to be able to write really good legislation. It takes money. And I have to give a shout out to Nick, who didn't really get much of a shout out. Since coming on as executive director, he has beaten the bushes hard with all kinds of funding organizations around the country. We've gotten more grant funding in the last 6 months than maybe in the last 3 years. I have to look at Beverly, is that about right? But the thing that we really need is your continued support, because the support of people at the grassroots level, and we've said that word again and again, organizing, grassroots, you know, that's what gives this organization credibility. It's all the people who believe in the organization, who invest in the organization, who want to see the work that this organization, the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, does succeed for all of us, no matter where we live, no matter the color of our skin, who we love, how we worship or not. We all deserve a government that represents us. And that's what the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign is all about. So your challenge, there's an envelope. You can put a check in it. Most people don't carry checks anymore, but there's a place there for you to put your credit card number. Please don't leave here without contributing to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Really important work and incredible people.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
And you guys, you're gonna make me cry 2 times today. Mom, I'm sorry I cried in front of you. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Please grab some food on the way out. Please be safe. And let's listen to Stevie Wonder on the way out here.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I want to say